Colonialism dominated global geopolitics from the early 1400s to arguably the late 1900s, as the major colonies finally claimed independence from European empires. The kingdoms defended and managed the colonies, often at huge public expense, because they allowed them to spread their influence and values around the world. It also helped that the colonies made huge private fortunes with the trade routes they opened between the riches of the East and the eager buyers back in Europe and the Americas. All manners of items were traded in these years, but tea and spice stood out amongst the rest as some of the most prized commodities that would be ferried back and forth over the world's oceans. The Dutch East India Company, widely considered by many to be the largest company in history, derived 70% of revenue from the sale of tea alone at the height of their power in the 1700s. Entire wars were fought over access to tea and spices, and untold human suffering was caused in the populations forced to grow and harvest something that was only really used to make hot water and overcooked meat taste slightly less shitty. So it's time to learn how history works to find out why colonists were so obsessed with tea and spice. This week's lesson was made possible by my very first sponsor on my new channel, The Daily Upside, a totally free, high-quality business and finance newsletter. With a lot happening in the economy and markets, it's hard to weave through the opinions of talking heads and get the facts of what's really happening. The Daily Upside provides you everything you need to know in a fun, easy-to-read newsletter that over 750,000 people subscribe to, including myself. The newsletter was founded by a Wall Street veteran with the intent of providing clarity and context on the events shaping the world of business. Every weekday, they deliver a morning brief followed by more detailed stories that are shaping the business world. It's become something I read every morning, as it is informative, witty, and not dumbed down. They go beyond the headlines and provide real analysis on the most important news of the day. As fans of history, let me tell you that we are living in unprecedented times with the economy, and the best way to tell the story tomorrow is by keeping up with the facts today. And there's no better way to do that than with the Daily Upside. Start your day more informed with what's happening in the world of business and finance, and sign up for free using the link in the description below. Tropical spices like nutmeg and saffron were prized by wealthy people because they offered unique flavor experience compared to what they were used to in Europe. It's a common misconception that all European food was bland paste before this. Pre-colonial chefs were celebrated for the flavors they could make with things like salt, smoke, animal fat, ginger, honey, and a range of other flavor enhancers native to Europe. It's also a common misconception that spices from across the world were used to preserve meat before the advent of refrigerators. Spices like nutmeg did have antibacterial properties, and it was possible to use spices to cover the taste and smell of spoiled meat. But imported spices were far more expensive than locally sourced meat, so it would have been much cheaper just to butcher a new animal than it would have been to cover up the rotten taste with spices. Covering up the taste of a rotten piece of meat with 17th century nutmeg would be like trying to improve the taste of a microwave pizza by slathering it in beluga caviar. Maybe it could improve the taste, but at what cost? Spices were also not the most effective means of preserving food that colonial Europeans had available to them. That was salting and smoking, which drew moisture from the meat and made it harder for bacteria to grow. The Europeans had this figured out before they even knew what bacteria was. Spices were prized for the same reason we enjoy them to this day. They taste good. Feasts were a big part of high society and diplomacy, another thing that hasn't changed at all to this very day. But when you had royalty and nobility hosting one another, a sort of competition naturally formed to see who could host the most lavish feasts. Today, the rich will one-up each other with fine wines, expensive bottles of aged whiskey, and dinners prepared by world-famous chefs, but back in the 17th century, it was all about giving your guests the opportunity to taste foods prepared in spices brought from distant lands. It was a flex, and people are willing to pay a lot of money to flex. Tea became the go-to drink for nobility when discussing how to rule the world. Tea and spices became valuable because they were valuable. You can't impress your dinner guest with a microwave meal and a $5 bottle of wine today, and nobility couldn't impress other nobles with food that didn't come from across the world. The difficulty in moving tea and spice from where it could be grown to where it could be sold for more than its weight in gold meant that trading posts and shipping routes had to be established to connect the East and the West. Trade journeys were long and dangerous, so sailors needed to be very well compensated, and ship owners needed a big cut because there was a very strong chance their vessel would not survive the journey. If they were lucky enough to make it back to port, the crown would also tax the tea imports. Tea and taxes, I feel like there's a story there. Anyways, big overheads meant that tea and spice kept its big price tag and its prestige. One of the most profitable companies in the world today is the LVMH Group. The letters LVMH stand for Louis Vuitton, Moet, and Hennessy, all luxury brands that people consume to impress their party guests. To ask why 18th century colonists were so obsessed with tea and spice is the same question as why people in the modern day are so obsessed with buying overpriced clothes and liquor. It really makes the pain and suffering endured by the colonized populations that much more heartbreaking when you realize most of this was done so that someone could host a snooty tea party. But there is also more to this story. Tea and spice was big business in the colonial world, and it was driven largely by people's need to impress other people. But by the late 18th century, the price of tea had dropped to where commoners could enjoy it as a part of their everyday diet. It wasn't impressing anybody anymore. A funny little story is that high society started using pineapples as culinary symbols of wealth around this time. Pineapples, just like tea and spices, could only be grown in the tropics, but they were even harder to transport because they were perishable. Pineapples were often the centerpieces of royal feasts, with each fruit costing upwards of $8,000 in today's money. It wasn't until the 1900s that a pineapple farm in Hawaii and steam-powered shipping made the fruit affordable to regular people. Nobody would be impressed by a pineapple at a dinner party today, and in the late 18th century, people were no longer impressed with tea either. It had become a commodity. Really, the world's first internationally traded commodity. Because shipping in the colonial era was so slow, it was much easier to make everything locally than it was to trade, unless there was something that simply couldn't be made locally, like tea. Tea and spice wasn't the all-consuming way of life you might have thought it was. The average colonial-era European did not spend their life endlessly working to get their next tea fix. It was a luxury product that the rich and powerful enjoyed for a while before it, if you would pardon the pun, trickled down to everyday commoners. It wasn't so much the spice must flow, as it was, if we don't get our shipment of spices, Sir Reginald Snooty Boots will need to postpone his feast. Being in the luxury goods business and the commodities trading business before any other businesses existed means they were incredibly influential by default because there wasn't that much else to go on. Like all businesses, there is competition. Only in the colonial era, some of this competition was settled with cannon fire, which is much more exciting in the history books, so it gets talked about more. So people automatically start thinking about tea when they think about old Europeans. I also don't want to make it sound like tea and spice wasn't a big deal. It was. Luxury goods and commodities are still very important today. Heck, even tea and spices are very important today. But their importance is diluted by all the other amazing things that we buy and sell and trade all over the world with each other. Tea and spice really just paved the way for that. Now, if you want to find out what paved the way for the most powerful machine of death in the world, the nuclear submarine, then go and watch my video on how the first naval submarines were developed to take down blockades during the American Civil War. And if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing to keep on learning how history works.